So thank you all for joining us. I'm Michael Tauchis with Grow North. As you might have heard me just explain to Jake, Grow North covers the 8 most northeastern counties in the state. Unfortunately, Brittany Beyer isn't able to make it today. She had an unexpected surgery that she's currently recovering from. She's doing fine, but I'm host today. Zach Bruink, the city administrator from Rhinelander, will be joining us to help kind of moderate the discussion, hopefully in a few minutes here. And Jake Langenhahn with Wisconsin Towns Association is here to help us work through some of the ARPA funding dollars and questions. So Jake, it's all yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And I just want to say a few things. First of all, I wish Brittany a speedy and healthy recovery. And secondly, thank you so much for having me today. We've been doing a lot of programming with ARPA since its passage in March. And I like to joke that someday, being in this outreach, someday I'm going to write a book about ARPA, because being in this outreach specialist position provides me with a very unique perspective on ARPA's implementation and seeing communities plan on how they want to use the funds. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that the only one that's ever going to read it is probably our executive director here, Mike Colas. But that's fine. It's fine. So, and I like to say too, in regards to framing, that ARPA has this life cycle. And for the first 2 months of ARPA, we were basically in this phase of awareness, right? That there was this federal money that was out there for communities, and that communities should be preparing to request that money. Now we're slowly transitioning into this next chapter, which is a combination between awareness and the practical applications of ARPA, meaning that your town or your city or your village has likely already received your ARPA funds as of Friday of this past week. And your governing bodies are already starting to think about some of the applications that your ARPA funds can be used for in your communities. So for the purposes of the discussion today, what I'd like to do is just take a moment to review ARPA at a 10,000-foot view, so that, again, it can help develop questions, it can help foster discussion. And I think at the end of the day, making sure that we know the basics behind ARPA will serve us well, because when you're going back to your communities, you definitely want to know at least the baseline facts about ARPA and its allowable uses. And that's what this 10-minute, maybe not even 10-minute presentation is going to do for us today. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that title slide. Michael, can you see it? Excellent. Okay. So as I said, this is going to be a brief introduction to the American Rescue Plan Act. And if you've attended other Wisconsin Towns Association programs in the past, you know that we always like to start with our learning objectives. Our learning objectives serve as a roadmap of where we will be going throughout the program. So there's 3 main areas for this presentation. The first one is going to be explaining ARPA's historical significance. Before we get too far, I'm going to add one more thing. Please understand that the perspective that I have here today is specifically for town government. So if you're a village, if you're a city, please just keep that in mind, that there may be other applicable rules or standards that might apply for your community. But again, so for the presentation this morning or this afternoon, and for the discussion today, I'm really going to be approaching this from the town government mindset. So we're going to explain ARPA's historical significance in regards to town government. We're going to be taking a second to review the allowable uses for ARPA funds, which is on everybody's mind these days. And then finally, I'd like to review timeline and implementation. Remember how I said we were transitioning into that second chapter of ARPA? We're going to now take a look at where we are going. Okay, so we'll start with the first learning objective, which is ARPA's historical significance. As I said earlier, it was signed into law in March. It's the 4th COVID-19 related response bill. So we've seen prior COVID related response bills in the past that have addressed pandemic effects in different ways. This is the 4th one in line, and it's unique in some ways, and in some ways it almost builds upon some things that we've seen in the past. This is the first ever direct allocation to towns, which for the Wisconsin Towns Association is very important to us. You're going to hear me throughout the session today talk about how the state is responsible for distributing ARPA funds. Well, you might also be saying, well, what the heck does that Jake guy know about ARPA funding? Because he said it's a direct allocation to towns. And here's the thing. The reason why we consider it a direct allocation is because the state cannot place any additional requirements or standards on the use of the funds. The only ones that can provide the rules for ARPA is the federal government. So the state serves as a pass-through to non-entitlement communities. You'll hear me talk about non-entitlement communities a lot. Non-entitlement communities, it's a term that the federal government uses for communities with less than 50,000 in their population. I often get the question at the office here that, towns are, we don't have a single town that's over 50,000 in population in the state of Wisconsin, and they're referred to as non-entitlement communities. Well, does that mean that we're not going to get our funds? And the answer is no. It is just a population term that the federal government uses. And I should also make a note that if you're a community that has a population of over 50,000, you are an entitlement community. So especially for towns, this is historically significant because we haven't ever had a direct allocation like this before. And I'm a county official where I'm from. I'm a county board supervisor. We might have some individuals from the city or states or villages out there. If that is the case, please plug your ears. I do truly believe that town government is the most fiscally responsible form of local government. And with that, as part of our character, comes a level of responsibility. It's a high level of responsibility that we need to ensure that we can demonstrate that these funds will be used effectively and efficiently in our communities. All right, allowable uses. So everything that we know about ARPA thus far has been interpreted from guidance that has been released from the Treasury. So the big one that is out there is called the interim final rule. The interim final rule is a 151-page document that talks about ARPA in great detail. It's the Treasury's interpretation of what was passed in March. It does provide some clarity regarding the allowable uses of ARPA funds. However, I'm just going to be perfectly honest with you. For every one question that we had answered on May 10th when the interim final rule was released, we now have another 3. During this time, we, at the association, plan on submitting questions during the public comment period to get some greater clarification before the final rule is released. And, we have a lot of questions regarding transferring and broadband projects. So, what we do know, though, is that the interim final rule does provide a very stable direction as far as where ARPA is heading. So we can interpret a lot from the language that's been released thus far. The Treasury numerous times in their guidance has examples that they bring up, and they stress over and over that these examples of projects are non-exclusive, meaning that if your community has a project that you do not explicitly see in the interim final rule, that doesn't mean that it's not a eligible project. But it does mean that if you have this project that you think might be eligible under ARPA, you need to review all of the ARPA guidance that's out there to make sure that the project is fulfilling all of ARPA's requirements. Okay, so with that being said, the approach that we've been recommending at the association is that if you do have a project in mind, you should be approaching it from a standpoint of, here is this project, right? The project that your town board or wherever is considering. How does that fit into how does that fit into these categories that we have on the screen right here? So let's go through the categories. There are 5 allowable uses of ARPA funds. The first one is to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency, to respond to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic, to provide premium pay to essential workers or grants to employers with essential workers, to replace lost, delayed, or decreased revenue, and to make necessary investments in water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. So if your community has a project that they would like to pursue with ARPA funds, the very first thing I would recommend you do is say, how does this project fit into one of these categories? I'm going to be honest with you. There will be a lot of projects that when you get to this part of your approach, you're not going to be able to do. But there are some that I've just been in talking with town officials lately that fit into multiple categories. So either way, it's a necessary step before you get very far with ARPA is to see if the project in mind can meet one of these categories. Okay, next steps in the implementation process. So June 18th was a big day for ARPA because June 18th was the day that communities, or I should say non-entitlement units, were required to have their SL 330s completed in the My DOR Gov account. So a couple things to keep in mind in order to complete that SL 330, if you haven't already. You need to ensure that your district has a valid DUNS number. I always recommend searching to see whether or not your community already has a valid DUNS number because it might save you some steps in the application process. You should also confirm that you have an active SAM registration. So this one is very important for towns in particular because once you have submitted the SL 330, the very next thing you should be thinking of is getting that SAM registration, because for non-entitlement units, the first round of ARPA reporting will take place in October. I think the first report is due October 31st, 2021. You will need to have a SAM in order to complete that report. So get that done as soon as possible so that you're not far behind when that October 31 date rolls around. Other basics here, ensure that your municipal clerk or treasurer has contact information that's accurate in the My DOR Gov account. I mentioned this only because, we just had a round of elections in April and some new officials are out there, in which case, please make sure that your contact info is updated. I already said that the form SL 330 needs to be completed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The last URL on this page is a really great resource that the Department of Revenue has put together for ARPA. They include webinars on the webinars that they've hosted on there, the webinar recordings, I guess I should say, and a lot of it's a general resource that I think that local government officials should continue to monitor going forward for up-to-date ARPA information and for other resources that can help you out through the ARPA process. All right, so as of this morning, I think we have 36 non-filers that have not completed the request for ARPA funds. If you are a community that has not made that request, obviously it's a decision for your community, your town board, your governing body to make whether or not you want to apply for these ARPA funds. But if your community decides to and you haven't completed that SL 330 yet, please get in contact with the DOR immediately. Their phone number is there, and their general email address for all things ARPA is listed on the screen right now. We at the association intend on providing comments during the interim rule comment phase. And we at the association also like to advocate for targeted patients during ARPA. If your community right now is aware of a project that you truly believe that you can use your ARPA funds for and they meet all the requirements of ARPA, by all means, go for it. But otherwise, if you're a community that would like to learn a little bit more about ARPA, we recommend patience because we're still waiting for the final rules release. The final rule should be released sometime in August because there's a 60-day public comment period that they're going through right now, in which case we will continue to learn more about ARPA as time goes on. There's a long time horizon with this, guys. You have to commit your funds by December 31st, 2024, and you have to complete your projects by December 31st, 2026. So over time, we'll continue to learn more. But if your community identifies a project that satisfies all those requirements, by all means, go for it. All right, last slide here, and then we'll transition to some Q&A here. So we have noticed just in the past month that there's a lot of misinformation regarding ARPA. And one of the things that we'd like to do is just to clear up some of that information. So some communities thought or currently think that there's a penalty for returning ARPA funds to the federal government if you do not use them. There is no penalty. There's actually language in the Treasury's interim final rule that discusses the process of returning those funds if you do not use them, and there is no mention of a penalty there. Secondly, we've heard some concerns that there's a shared cost formula that's going to sap up your general fund if you use them. And actually, there's a section in the terms and conditions that prohibits cost sharing. And the last one, and this one, this one I really want to stress because those 5 allowable use categories I just talked about very briefly here, at least at face value, for a lot of towns in particular, they might not think that, oh, there's nothing that you can use the monies on. And that's not the case. I'm probably going to be talking a little bit about lost revenue today. And that's a huge opportunity for local governments in particular to use their monies for things like infrastructure and public health and safety, like fire and EMS. And, the historical context, in regards to the CARES Act with R2R, which was the program that a lot of communities used last year, we learned a lot about the CARES Act as time went on. We learned a lot more about allowable uses as time went on. So, if you request the funds and you do not use them, December 31st, 2024, you're expected to return them to the federal government. There's no penalty for it. In fact, I believe you can actually keep the interest that you earn off of those funds. So that is this slide is necessary because we don't want towns to be acting with bad information that's out there. Okay, this slide is just our contact information. If you're a town or village member, please feel free to contact us if you have any ARPA questions. That's kind of my role around here right now, and we've been spending a lot of time just in the past month reviewing all the guidance that's been released by Treasury. And I kid you not, it gets released weekly, if not daily. It's a very exciting time for local government right now in the entire country with these funds, because it represents a lot of different opportunity, or it allows local governments to explore some exciting opportunities that they did not have available to them before. So, Michael, that is ARPA through the town's perspective at a 10,000-foot view. I hope that frames the discussion well that's going to take place today. Zach, I see you joined us. Welcome. Good to have you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Excellent. Well, great presentation, Jake. And there's obviously so much information to digest on this topic, particularly for those that are volunteers or serving in a very part-time capacity. It's difficult to get our arms around all the aspects, but thanks to the Towns Association for trying to digest this, and to Grow North for curating the information. I'm Zach Fruling. For those who don't know me, I'm the city administrator here in Rhinelander. Previously served as the mayor of Wisconsin Rapids for 8 years. And so I have an affinity for local government and what local government can do. And this is really a moment in time to make a difference, I think, as we have always had some of those wish list projects that we wish we could deal with this if we didn't have budget constraints and levy limits and all the other fun stuff for which we live within. So I really want to move into question and answer. So I think the best way to do this would be, I can see folks that are muted if they wish to unmute. I think if they're calling in, it's with *6, but it looks like everybody's all in their on the Zoom app, so they should be able to unmute themselves. Does anybody have a question to kick off our discussion? Or if you don't have a question, offer a potential suggested use, or maybe how your town is looking at utilizing and stimulating really your local community or local town in which you represent. I know the issue of broadband comes up quite often. Anybody looking to deal with any or partner on any broadband initiatives, either within your region or in your county with your ARPA monies? No broadband uses. Jake, maybe you can offer something.
Yeah. Again, my town government bias here, but one of the things that we often get here at the association, I mean, obviously, for town governments in particular, the highest priority on the list is roads, is infrastructure, is how do we maintain our current infrastructure for our communities. And I think that in regards to Grow North's mission here, on the front page of your guys' website, you got 3 areas, right? You got your workforce cultivation, you got your housing, you got your innovation entrepreneurship. So let's think about this. Workforce cultivation, roads. We often refer to town roads as the first and last mile of infrastructure, because the raw materials are harvested from that farm or from whatever business. They're taken to a different business, possibly in a village or a city or another town. They're processed, and then the consumers back in that town It's delivered on a town road by a FedEx truck or Amazon truck or whatever. And you know, what that demonstrates is that there's the town roads are in particular are the backbone of a lot of economies. So, you know, in regards to housing, obviously, you know, you need good infrastructure to encourage housing in your communities. And innovation entrepreneurship, I think, is just really closely with business. That I'm sure that your businesses in your communities would appreciate having good infrastructure so that their products and their raw materials can come in and go out safely. So in regards to infrastructure, for local governments to use ARPA funds for it, it's not going to be as simple as, you know, you received $100,000 in ARPA funds and the Treasury has waved a magic wand and said, you can use that on infrastructure. It's not going to be that straightforward. But remember when I talked about allowable uses, right? There was one of them that I brought up that was replacing lost revenue. And replacing lost revenue is not going to be as simple as comparing your 2019 budget numbers to your 2020 budget numbers. It's a little bit more, it's a more rigorous analysis than just that. So I just want to walk through it really quickly because roads are at the forefront of a lot of discussions right now. So if you can prove lost revenue, you can use ARPA funds for that amount, whatever revenue amount that you lost, for the provision of a broad range of government services. And actually in the interim final rule, the Treasury includes roads. So this is very exciting for us. In order to prove lost revenue, you have to do this analysis 4 times. You have to do it in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And essentially what you're doing is you're comparing 2 values. The first one is your actual revenues that you took in for that year, and you're comparing it to something called your counterfactual revenue. You determine your counterfactual revenue through an equation that's been provided by the Treasury. I don't know if I can pull this up. Just give me 1 second here. I might actually be able to pull it up in the interim final rule because I think that it does a good job at, let's see here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen one more time here. Just excuse me 1 second. All right, Michael, can you see this? Should be a PDF document? Perfect. Okay. So estimate your counterfactual revenue. And here's the equation. It's your base year revenue, which is going to be 2019 for towns in particular. It times your 1 plus your growth adjustment to the n divided by 12. At face value, this looks very scary. It's not that bad. I've done the analysis before. It takes some time to go through and get all these values, but it is very doable. So you use this formula to determine that counterfactual revenue for that year. So just for the sake of an example today, let's say that you were going to do this for 2020. In fact, you can only do it for 2020 because that is the only year that's been completed with that 20, 21, 22, and 23 sequence. So you would get your actual revenues, and then you would determine this counterfactual number. The interesting thing about this is that and Zach actually talked about this when we started here, is with levy limits. And I often get the comment that, hey, you know, local governments' revenues are constrained because, you know, levy limits limit the amount of revenue that come in every year. But here's the thing. One of the items there is in that counterfactual revenue equation is something called a growth adjustment. The growth adjustment is one of 2 numbers. It's either equal to 4.1% or it's equal to your 3-year average growth for the 3 budget years prior to COVID-19. For a lot of local governments, that's going to be around, I don't know, probably 2%. And all that's going to depend on the factors within your community. Because, you know, especially for town governments, that's probably just your net new construction with your growth there. Well, 4.1% when you're doing this counterfactual revenue is going to be very generous. When I did the analysis for just a small hypothetical town, I was able to find that I think their budget that I'd used in my example is around $200,000 and some odd $1,000. By the end of the 4 years of those calculations, I had projected that they would lose about $50,000. So that was very surprising. And a lot of it comes back to that 4.1%, which will be very generous in your calculations. So just to reiterate, when you're doing with that analysis, the actual to the counterfactual, you know, if your counterfactual is I don't know, $5,000 more than your actual, you can now take $5,000 in ARPA funds and use it on roads, fire and EMS. The actual range of government services. Right now, we have some direction from Treasury in their interim final rule language, but they specifically say a broad range of services. So, but like I said, infrastructure, fire, and EMS, those are the big three beasts that town government has to tackle. So that one in particular is very, very exciting for us. Maybe that'll spur some discussion.
Yeah, revenue loss is kind of in demystifying it. So thanks for pulling that up, because I think the calculation of the Treasury rules can be really daunting or intimidating to look at, I think, for all of us. So anybody looking to utilize that method to potentially utilize their funds. I'm actually curious, not knowing the other folks on the call, I apologize for having missed introductions, but what level of funding are some of the towns that are on the call receiving? Anybody want to volunteer how much you're receiving in ARPA funds?
We're receiving 11,000.
11,000. Okay.
Heather, is this?
Oops.
Go ahead, Georgine. I apologize.
Our town is receiving a total of 88,000 between the 2 years.
Okay.
I was just going to ask Heather if that was just the first tranche of payments, or if that was the first and the second tranche put together.
That's the first.
Gotcha.
Great. And what's a lane mile of paving run these days for some of you?
Hi, this is Angie Close. I'm with Langley County Economic Development, and I apologize that I'm late as well. And I just kind of got into this a little bit, but as far as our townships, it's about an average of about $45,000 that they're receiving in the both funding total. But I just got the information in regards to 1 mile of fiber is around 40,000.
Yeah.
And I can speak a little bit more to that because this can transition very well. This serves as a very good transition into the broadband discussion. So given that number that was just thrown out there, you know, in my town, we're going to receive about $110,000 between the first and second tranches. So our total amount is that 110. You know, I live in a county, I'll just say Marathon County, where we have the largest landmass of counties in all the 72. So to be honest with you all, our ARPA allocation just in our town isn't going to be enough to put in fiber for every single mile of road in there. It's just not going to be possible. And based on the Treasury's standards for completed broadband projects with the 100 megabytes upload and download speeds, you know, I'm not a broadband guru. You know, I'm never going to claim to be a broadband guru, but what I do know about broadband is that that 100 megabytes symmetrical upload download is really only going to be achieved through fiber. I've heard some towns that were talking about putting in towers, and you know, in our research here at the association, we just don't. Obviously towers will continue to improve every year, but we just don't believe that that service requirement is going to be achieved just through putting up a tower at this time. So we've also heard of some communities talking about partnering regionally with counties to put together a broadband project. That's very popular right now. I would just throw some words. I don't mean to throw a bucket of cold water on anybody, but the concern that we have with this is that is the transfer piece, and there's a couple things there. So first of all, we're looking into the transfer piece in particular because we're not quite sure if horizontal transfers or specific vertical transfers through ARPA are eligible right now. If you look at the interim final rules language, they do not mention specifically the horizontal transfers between a town to a town or a city to a village. So that's an area we're looking for greater clarification from right now. And I mean, it's an area that we're asking questions on during the public comment phase of the interim final rule. The other thing that we're a little concerned with is that it doesn't mention anything about, or it doesn't provide a lot of clarity regarding when a lower level government transfers money to a higher level government, such as a county, and the resulting project and the standards that are expected there. So there's some language, I think it's on page 106 and 107 of the interim final rule, where it talks about how if you were to transfer monies, like let's say $10,000 to another community, there's this expectation that that $10,000 still impact your community proportionally. So if we're talking about a countywide project, there's a little bit of a concern there that if a town were to transfer that money to a county government, that they would see that reflected in their broadband service upon the project's completion in their own community. That is something that, again, we're asking Treasury for more clarification on right now, going forward. The largest area that we've seen an opportunity specifically for town government and local governments in general right now to use ARPA funds for broadband projects is the broadband grants that have been available through the state of Wisconsin. Like just recently, there was $100 million made available. You know, you could use those ARPA funds to leverage broadband monies during that grant process. And I think actually the state of Wisconsin is making another $100 million available through their own ARPA funds. Don't quote me on that. I still have to do a little bit more research, but I think there's additional opportunities out there for the broadband funding. So that's the town government's perspective in regards to using ARPA funds for broadband projects.
That's a great segue into a question that I was hoping to raise, and that is if and how others were trying to partner. And so, Jake, thanks for clarifying kind of the preliminary information on the kind of prohibition or limitations of partnership. Yeah, I was hoping that the county allocations would come up on this call, because I think that's where there's an opportunity to work with the county and to connect with your county supervisors to, you know, in the vein of this being stimulus money, how do we stimulate some of that economic activity that the purpose of the COVID relief or the stimulus dollars came down, obviously to protect ourselves and to kind of deal with some issues, lingering issues post-pandemic, but also to stimulate economic activity to really rebound and have a strong economic recovery. So, you know, I don't know, I can speak for Oneida County, if anybody else is from Oneida County, but it sounds like the chairman has put together a funding opportunities committee that's starting to meet. I would suspect some of your other counties, if you're not from Oneida County, are doing something similar. So I would encourage you to connect with those folks, check their meeting minutes or agendas for any discussion about ARPA, and be present. I encourage you to be present at those meetings. I know that for the city and Rhinelander, you know, we're receiving a significantly larger proportionally than some of the towns. So I think, but at the same time, you know, putting in a mile or a half mile of water pipe is going to take our whole allocation, right? So, or replacing some of our infrastructure, so it's very expensive, right? So, but Oneida County is getting just under 7 million. And how can proportionately, if we were to think about it, and for Rhinelander, it's about $1.3 million of that 7 million. It could be argued that on a proportional basis has been given to the county via Rhinelander statistics. So you may want to think about it from that approach, from a calculation standpoint for a conversation, just to know how you can drive some benefit in partnership. And it's not so much maybe giving your money up or down, but how do you ensure that some of those stimulus dollars flow into your townships? I think that's really important. Questions? How do you spend it? What can you spend it on? I know there's a lot of webinars and things floating around out there, so maybe these questions are already answered. And I think for those that may, you know, have a $10,000 expense, if you can figure out a way to kind of, I'll use the word wash, maybe isn't the most appropriate use, but to apply the revenue recalculation to recapture some of those lost dollars for the purposes of some other priorities that the town might have. But I keep reminding myself and our city council here, it's a lot about stimulus and how do we stimulate activity? How do we get something done that wouldn't have otherwise happened, that could create new wealth or create new jobs or retain employment? I think that's also a big component of the legislation, is to make sure that we're not losing more jobs as a result of coming out of the pandemic. So I think those are the ways that some of us are thinking about it. Well, Michael, I think looks like we don't have any other questions or anything to add. Does anybody have any comments, any thoughts? Or is it all Georgine, you've got something?
Well, I'm just sitting back here listening to all of this, and I'm the clerk for the town of King, and we have 855 people, permanent people in this little town, and it's been put on to me from our board members to find out more as to what we're supposed to use or able to use this money for. And right now, I just listening to this, I still feel like there's probably not a whole lot we can use this for. I'm new, so I was just newly appointed in April or elected in April, and I still learning so much about being a clerk, so I don't know everything that we can and can't do. I don't know a lot. So right now I'm thinking that what do we use this for? We're so rural. We're just outside of Tomahawk, and Tomahawk, of course, I could see there'd be more for the town of Tomahawk to be using this for. But our little town, I mean, yes, our roads are in bad shape. How are we able to use them for any of our road? We have a lot on our plate for fixing our roads right now. We have a broken down truck that one of our employees uses to go around and do maintenance on our town roads, put up road signs, fill in gravel potholes and stuff that is broken down. And we're hoping that we could maybe use some of that money to put towards a different vehicle for our town hall and our town. But I don't know, is that even possible? What do it seems like this is a whole lot of money, and unless we can prove that this is COVID related or pandemic related, it doesn't seem like we can use this money. Sorry, I got a little long-winded.
Yeah, Jake, go ahead and take it.
Yeah,
I'll offer some thoughts too. Go ahead though.
Georgine, a couple things. First of all, congratulations for April and all new officials that we have on here. On the call today. Secondly, in regards to, and I had mentioned this earlier on the call, that when you're thinking about whether or not the project would be eligible for using ARPA funds for, you have to be approaching it through, here's the project, which category, which ARPA category of allowable uses would this fit under? And I'm going to guarantee you that if you're able, you go back to your town board and say that you can use ARPA funds for roads, that they're going to be excited. I can guarantee you.
I know they will.
Yep. And you can, but you can through each of the, well, just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So. Okay, so here are those 5 categories again, right? So the question is, how can you use, or can you use ARPA funds for roads? And out of these 5 categories that we have here, the category that this would likely go under would be this replace, lost, delayed, or decreased revenue. Under this category, as I said before, the Treasury has said that, if you're able to prove that your community lost revenue, you can use that lost revenue for a wide variety you can use it for the provision of a wide variety of government services. And they specifically say roads. So as I said before, if you're able to prove that you lost $10,000, you can then take $10,000 of ARPA funds and use them on road maintenance. You can use them on, we use fire and EMS a lot, specifically because towns are required to provide fire service and EMS service statutorily required to do that. So, that's a cost that continues to increase every year for all local government, I guess I should say. And, you could make the argument that, well, I shouldn't say you could make the argument. I mean, it's a good argument because it's sound, that, providing fire and EMS service, that's something that your government has to do. And, you can take those lost revenue funds through ARPA and you can use them to pay for a ambulance or a fire truck, but it has to be through lost revenue. Now, in regards to your question about this truck that the town has, it's run down, and your highway person uses the town vehicle to go around and do maintenance. I would say that, based on the direction from the Treasury thus far, that, you're in order for your town to directly provide this infrastructure service that the highway person is providing, that they would need this vehicle in order to provide it. Well, I think you can make the argument that to provide the service, that having this truck would be necessary to provide that infrastructure service. So, I'm not a representative from the Treasury, so I can't tell you for certain whether or not your project would be approved. But I think you have a sound argument thus far that you could possibly use the ARPA funds through lost revenue to purchase that vehicle.
Yeah, because right now that employee that's paid by the town of King, he's been using his own vehicle for it, and we kind of reimburse. And his vehicle is broken down, and so we just really need this vehicle to be upgraded, whatever, because we rely on it so much for our little town. But how do we prove that lost revenue, or to make sure that we would be reimbursed for something like this?
Sure. And this is another, thank you for the question, because this reminds me of something else. So we are currently working with our, I guess you could say, brother and sister associations to work with the Department of Revenue to develop a resource. Ideally, we'd like it to be something like a calculator or something like that, where the local government could take the items from their Form C or their Form CT, plug them into this calculator, and it could give you the result of the revenue loss. That's what we would like to see. And like I said, we're currently working with the DOR to put that tool together. Now, the actual process that your community will have to go through in order to prove revenue loss, I had mentioned it earlier on the call, but I can walk through it again very quickly here. So you're going to do this analysis 4 times. You're going to do it in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. And you compare 2 things. One is your actual revenue for that year. So like in this case, we can only do it for 2020 because that's the only year that's been completed thus far. So you compare your actual revenue for 2020 and you compare it to your counterfactual revenue for 2021. Counterfactual revenue is just a term that the Treasury uses to refer to this amount that your town would have received if the pandemic had never happened, and they provide a formula for that. You compare those 2 numbers. Your counterfactual, if it's more than your actual revenue, there's a revenue loss there. Whatever that difference is, whatever amount that is, you can now take the corresponding amount in ARPA dollars and use it for that broad provision of government services. So that's how you prove it. You do it 4 times, as I said, in 20, 21, 22, and 23. We've been brainstorming different ideas here and hearing from different towns. Some towns are thinking that they're going to bank, maybe bank isn't the right word, but they're going to take each of those numbers every year up until 2024. So January 1, 2024, they're going to look back and they're going to do the calculations for those 4 years, add those all together, and then do a bigger infrastructure project rather than doing it in 2021 for 2020 and taking a smaller amount and maybe using it for a smaller infrastructure project. So again, like, these are the things that your community at the 2nd chapter, right? I talked about that earlier, that we're going through a book right now. And now the process that your town should be undertaking is, and your town board discussion should be centering around is, here are the allowable uses. What are some projects that we're thinking of that can fit into these different categories? Roads, that's one that we clearly believe can fit in under that broad provision of government services. The key thing there, I would just go back to the truck example, because I think it's a good one, is that the Treasury talks about the direct provision of service. So whatever project that you decide to do with that lost revenue piece, it has to be directly providing service to the citizens. That's an important point that I should bring up there. So we'll have the Towns Association, and I'm sure the League, and I'm sure WCA, I'm sure all of them will have more resources on this in the future. In fact, some of them have actually developed their own calculators already, which for us is we want to just stress that we don't want to get into a scenario where we have different calculators out there and town governments or cities or villages are plugging in their numbers and they're getting different results. We certainly don't want that. That's why we're hoping that the DOR can work with us here and that we can put together this resource for everybody so that we can standardize it in relation to your Form C and your Form CT. So Georgine, I don't know if that muddied the waters or if it helped. But.
I'm still going to have questions, and again, we'll be discussing in our town meeting coming up in June in length. But I just want to go into that meeting with as much information as I can because I'm the one that's relaying this to all of them. And I just certainly don't want to tell them the wrong thing. So I think there's so much to learn on this that I don't think I can get it all to them by this month's meeting. So I guess we just see how it goes. I'll keep looking at everything, and hopefully there's something that or more tutorials or something that can help us through it. I
think that's Jake's point that there's no rush. I mean, while we all want to stimulate the economy and see the money go back out the door, you really have some time. So I think don't feel too anxious about having all the answers at this stage because there is so much information. And as Jake said, some of the qualifications are very preliminary and interim. They're not final rules necessarily. So as the state and all these organizations and everybody else gets the information, we're trying to synthesize it. So don't feel like you got to have all the answers, especially for your board members who are trying to maybe find a way to meet their need as they see it. There are other financing vehicles out there, such as the BCPL, which is the Board of Public Lands. They've got a loan program. And so there's a number of some of those more traditional financing needs. You may want to just look at what your borrowing capacity is if your town feels willing to take on any sort of debt. But Jake had a really good point, I think, on the look back to maybe wait some time, do a look back, and then it'll maybe afford you some greater ability to draw down those funds.
I do have a question. Oh,
thank you.
Thank you, Georgine. Sorry, go ahead, Angie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do have a question, and I apologize for coming in late. So the towns that did not accept the money, do they? I mean, being that all of this information is not out there yet, and they just felt that the dollars that they didn't have any eligible projects and they just didn't want the hassle. Is there another period that they'll be able to either, now that we're finding out more ways to help them out and looking at strategies for those dollars, is there another period that they're going to be able to accept that money or no?
Good question. So as of I said earlier this morning, I was made aware that there are, and for us is, there's 1,246 towns in the state of Wisconsin. There are currently 32 non-filers. So the vast majority of towns have applied for the money. For those that have not requested the funds, there's the main thing that they should do is right now is get in contact with the Department of Revenue, work with them to request the funds. So that if a town were to go on the Department of Revenue website, I think the Department of Revenue I know that the Department of Revenue has a ARPA page, and there's some contact information there that they can go through to work with them. Either way, they're going to have to fill out that SL 330. So, get a DUNS number, get all that information together in order to request it. I'm just trying to think of some of the other things. As far as a firm deadline, to the best of the knowledge of the WTA right now, we do not know of a firm deadline of a cutoff, so to speak, with ARPA funds. So there is some language from the from the Treasury in regards to redistributing ARPA funds to other non-entitlement units. We had first thought this was going to be a process where the state was going to be expected to transfer any unclaimed monies to other NEUs. But upon our further review, there's I work with a lot of attorneys here. I myself am not an attorney, but I do know that there's a big difference between the words must and can. And it is a can distributed to other NEUs. So while we don't know of a firm cutoff date, I would just say that, be prompt with this. especially because, receiving the funds, you'll have that first round of ARPA reporting to do in October. So I would just make sure to be prompt, get your ducks in a row, and go from there. In regards to what the WTA is doing, we do a lot of, I travel to a lot of county units and we give the ARPA presentation there. If you know of any county, or if you know of any towns that are hesitant to accept this money, but are still curious about it, please feel free to refer them to the WTA. And actually, I think maybe next week or the following week, we intend on doing an exclusive webinar just for those 32, that if they are still curious or hesitant, they can come to that webinar and ask questions for the WTA staff on ARPA funds. So we here throughout this entire process are just focused on getting as much information to towns as possible regarding ARPA, so that your governing bodies can make the best decision possible.
Is that the one on July 14th? Or I'm sorry, there was another webinar on July 14th at noon. Is that the same one or no that you were talking about? No,
that one actually hasn't. That one actually hasn't been scheduled yet.
Okay, all right.
We had a couple of night webinars this week in between county unit meetings. We don't like to schedule conflicting meetings, so yeah, okay. I think we're going to try and do that next week. Or I'm realizing that next week's July 4th, so we might do it the following week.
Sure. No, that's helpful. Thank you for that information. I want to make sure and pass that on. Is there a list on the DOR of the 32 non-filers that we would know exactly who it is?
The DOR has not provided that list to me.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not certain who specifically hasn't applied yet. But like I said, any towns that are still in that phase where they're hesitant to accept the money, we will most certainly work with them, because as I said before, it's ultimately going to be a decision for that town to accept the money. But if they have questions, obviously WTA is here for them.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And the other thing too, for Langley County, I just came in on that, but we are actually utilizing, just like you said, Jake, in regards to the ARPA funds with a broadband project with the townships in regards to going for the $100 million PSC grants that's due in July. So it really does help with that matching portion to get that. And it will, what ours will be on is laying fiber to 2 towers that will connect over 138 residents, but then also it'll give us the opportunity to simulcast those towers for our EMS and rural fire control to make better communications. So that's exactly what we're going to be utilizing some of those funds for, and utilizing that grant.
That's very exciting, Angie.
Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any closing questions or comments from anybody? Looks like Patricia, you unmuted yourself, or you are unmuted. I'm not sure if you had a question. Otherwise, Jake or Michael, I'll turn it back over to you.
Can I tell one quick story? We got 4 minutes left here. I just want to tell a really quick story. Is that okay?
It's perfect.
Okay. So as I said before, as the outreach specialist, I do a lot of traveling to county unit meetings, which if you're a town, please look into attending your county unit meetings. We do a lot of educational programming there. Please think about attending there. They are for all local government officials. This was about a month ago, and I was in county. I was giving our ARPA programming presentation, which is a much larger presentation than what I gave at the beginning of this call. And I was up at a podium and I was answering questions for a Q&A, and a person had asked, for towns, do they have to have a DUNS number and a SAM registration in order to receive their ARPA funds? And at that time, based on the direction from Treasury, we had inferred that towns only had to have a DUNS number and they did not need to have a SAM registration. So I answered that what I just said. I said, you just need to have a DUNS number. You do not need to have a SAM registration. While I was giving that response, my phone, I had it in my jacket pocket, it buzzed. And I mean, that can happen for a variety of reasons, right? It could be, a text message, email, whatever. So finished the presentation, county unit meeting ended. I went back out to my car to drive home. Well, I sat down to pull out my phone to check my messages, and it was an email from our executive director, Mike Colas, who had basically said that, hey, that whole thing about just having a DUNS number, not needing a SAM account. Oh, now it looks like you need to have a SAM registration too. So that's just a story I'd like to tell to say that, there is a lot of information that over time we are just going to keep getting about ARPA. In that case, it was a very unfortunate situation where literally the timeliness of information was important in the response to my answer. And I will never, in giving a response, in mid-response, pull out my phone to check my messages, obviously, because that would be incredibly rude. But going forward, if you're in situations where, as Georgine had said earlier, where you're not quite sure about where you can spend this money, you can be patient. There's nothing wrong with that. To keep learning more. With the caveat that if you do know of a project that would satisfy all those requirements, obviously, as we had heard from Angie, with towns and partnering with their county to leverage those funds with that broadband grant, obviously go for it. That's going to be money that's going to be used to help improve your communities. If you're confident that it satisfies all of ARPA's requirements, go ahead. But if you want to learn more, you can be patient. So
awesome.
Okay, Michael, go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Well, I was just going to say, so Grow North is going to be hosting 2 more sessions on this. I believe it's July 14th and July 28th are going to be our next 2 meetings. And I'm not sure if Brittany has chosen a specific topic for the 14th, but I believe the 28th will be on how to use ARPA funds for housing as well.
Okay.
So thank you, Jake. And thank you, Zach, for moderating here. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. And we've recorded this, so hopefully we'll have a chance to send that out later as well. Thank you all.
All right, thanks, Zach.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank
you guys
you.
everybody have a good afternoon.
And a good
See ya.
4th.